On the morning of September 28, 1946, in the small Luxembourg town of Ham, a black staff car rolled slowly through a quiet road lined with 5,000 white marble crosses. The autumn air was cold and thin, drifting off the Alzette River, and the man sitting in the back of the car had not spoken in nearly an hour. He was no longer the supreme commander who had orchestrated the greatest amphibious invasion in human history. He was no longer the smiling general whose grin covered a continent on the morning of VE Day. He was Dwight David Eisenhower, and he was coming to stand above the freshly turned earth where his oldest, fiercest, most complicated friend lay buried. Behind him in the car sat his driver, an aide, and one Marine guard with drawn orders to keep the press 50 yards from the cemetery gate. Eisenhower had insisted on that distance himself. He did not want cameras near him on this day. He did not want microphones. He did not want questions about what he felt, or what he remembered, or what he thought the world had lost when George Smith Patton Jr. closed his eyes for the last time on the afternoon of December 21, 1945. 10 months earlier, in the 7th Army Headquarters Hospital in Heidelberg, Patton had stopped breathing. The death certificate said pulmonary edema. Senior physicians whispered pulmonary embolism. The younger officers whispered something else entirely. They whispered the word that had begun circulating through American military hospitals in Frankfurt, Mannheim, and Bad Nauheim like a forbidden rumor. They whispered assassination. Eisenhower knew all of this. He knew it because his intelligence officers had been reading the cables. He knew it because in August 1946, a British intelligence operative named Douglas Bazata had begun talking openly about a small glass vial of refined cyanide, allegedly manufactured in Czechoslovakia, and allegedly delivered to a weapons officer who had access to Patton's armored sedan. He knew it because reporters for the Hearst newspapers were already beginning to dig, and he knew it because on the night Patton died he had not been at the bedside. He had been 3,000 miles away, sleeping in the guest quarters of the White House, writing notes for President Truman. That wait, the distance, the unanswered questions, the absence from the final vigil was why Eisenhower was now riding alone through the gates of a cemetery in a foreign country. He was not there to perform a ritual. He was not there to honor a fallen subordinate in the formal way victors honor their generals at the end of a war. He was there because something inside him needed to know whether the silence, the secrecy, the strange 35-page medical file, the unsigned X-ray reports, the mislabeled paperwork, all of it, was finally finished. Eisenhower needed to look down into the Luxembourg soil and decide whether George Patton was at peace or whether the war that had killed him had actually never ended. The story of how Eisenhower arrived at that crossroads in Ham begins long before the crash. It begins in the tiny parlor of a house in Abilene, Kansas, in the spring of 1890, when two farm boys from very different worlds swore a kind of silent oath that they would one day wear the same uniform and march into the same storm. Eisenhower was 2 years older, quieter, smoother. Patton was loud, profane, theatrical, fearless on horseback. They met at West Point through Patton's cousin, who had married Eisenhower's classmate. Almost immediately they sized each other up in the peculiar way that future generals sometimes do, comparing saber drills, smoke breaks, and the way each handled a horse at full gallop across the Hudson Plain. Patton was already obsessed with cavalry as a kind of holy calling. Eisenhower was already obsessed with logistics, with the quiet mathematics of moving men, food, fuel, and steel across impossible distances. They had nothing in common in temperament. They had almost everything in common in ambition. By the time the United States entered the First World War, the two of them had been separated for nearly a decade. Eisenhower was training inexperienced tank crews in Pennsylvania. Patton was in France running the first American tank school at Langres. The war ended before they could fight shoulder to shoulder. Patton was bitterly disappointed. Eisenhower was quietly relieved. After the armistice, they drifted apart for nearly 20 more years, married different women, served in different branches, and built reputations that were almost the opposite of one another. Patton became the man the Army loved to hate. Eisenhower became the man the Army loved to promote. Behind the gossip, however, a strange mutual respect survived. Eisenhower watched Patton develop the American doctrine of armored warfare. Patton watched Eisenhower rise through the war college system. When the German Wehrmacht began tearing across Poland in 1939, both men understood that the long delay was finally over, and that their careers would either detonate into legend or explode into history with nothing between them. What neither of them knew in 1940 was that the same war would one day leave Patton paralyzed in a German hospital bed, while Eisenhower sat 3,000 miles away talking politics with the President of the United States. Neither of them knew that one of them would outlive the other by almost 2 decades, haunted by a question he could never fully answer. Neither of them knew that 10 months after Patton closed his eyes for the last time, the surviving half of that old Kansas pact would silently stand above a marble cross in Luxembourg and whisper a single sentence that no recorder ever caught and no witness ever repeated in public. But the world would feel it for the rest of the century. The crash that broke George Patton began on a foggy Monday morning in Mannheim, Germany on December 9, 1945. He was riding in the rear seat of a custom-built Cadillac staff sedan, license plate number driven by a young PFC named Horace Woodring, with a captain from his staff in the front passenger seat, when the car attempted to pass a military GMC truck on a narrow side street near the Rhine Bridge at Speyer Road. Witnesses said the Cadillac accelerated, then braked hard, then swung back across the lane and collided head-on with the rear of the oncoming truck. The crash itself was so slow and so quiet that several bystanders walking nearby at first thought it was a minor parking accident. They were wrong, however. The impact crushed Patton's head against the metal frame of the rear seat and snapped his 3rd and 4th cervical vertebrae, partially severing the spinal cord and paralyzing him almost completely from the neck down. The ambulance arrived in 11 minutes. The doctors at 7th Army General Hospital performed emergency surgery within the hour. Patton was conscious the entire time. According to one nurse, his first words after regaining awareness in the operating theater were the following. He said, "Tell Beatrice I'm alive. Tell Beatrice I'm alive." It was an extraordinary sentence from a man who had spent the previous month denouncing the Eisenhower administration for being too soft on the Nazis, telling reporters in printed Heidelberg that denazification was a farce, and declaring publicly that the United States had fought the wrong enemy and should now turn its armies eastward toward the Soviet Union. Those words alone had turned Washington into a pressure cooker. Patton had even accused the Soviets of starting the war, and he had insisted that Germany was being treated more harshly than the Soviet Union, which he felt was bizarre, because in his view the Soviets were the ones carrying the most post-war responsibility for destabilizing Eastern Europe. Behind closed doors, however, the most aggressive thing he had done was even more dangerous. He had begun quietly suggesting to several officers that Eisenhower's SHAEF staff had deliberately ignored German technical secrets, refused to integrate Wehrmacht officers into the new American army, and prevented Patton from acquiring a stockpile of Panzerfaust rockets and 88mm ammunition that could have been turned against the Red Army in the event of a NATO-Soviet confrontation. In other words, Patton was talking about a third war before the first peace had even been signed. The crash silenced him for a moment, but then the silence turned into a darker rumor. Within 72 hours of the Mannheim accident, an unverified cable from a former counterintelligence corps officer in Frankfurt arrived at the office of the Assistant Secretary of War. It claimed that the Cadillac had been sabotaged, it claimed that the brakes had been tampered with, it claimed that the truck driver had been paid $3,000 by a Soviet-linked agent in the French zone of occupation. It claimed that Patton had been silenced because he had been about to publicly accuse American and British intelligence services of protecting Nazi scientists and smuggling them into the Soviet sphere in exchange for early Cold War cooperation. None of those allegations were ever proven. But almost none of them were ever fully investigated either, and when Patton died 12 days after the crash on December 21, 1945, the official cause of death appeared on the certificate as pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure secondary to a pulmonary embolism caused by cervical spinal trauma. Several Army physicians, however, including one lieutenant colonel who had personally attended Patton at the hospital, later confided to journalist Robert Wilcox decades later that they had been pressured to suppress the phrase acute pulmonary embolism from the public version of the autopsy. The phrase acute pulmonary embolism, they argued, sounded suspicious. It sounded too clinical. It sounded suspiciously close to the pattern described in early manuals for chemical assassination using a refined form of cyanide that mimics natural blood clotting failure. Whether or not any of that was true, one fact remained. Patton was gone. The greatest American battlefield commander of the 20th century was dead at the age of 60, only 3.5 months after the formal Japanese surrender, at the very moment the United States was beginning to construct the post-war order that Eisenhower would soon oversee. And the man who had taken Patton's job in Europe, who had moved into Patton's headquarters, who had dismissed Patton from his last combat command in the final days of the war for insubordination over Jewish refugee camps, was now floating circles around Truman's desk, preparing to become something more important than a field commander. Eisenhower was about to become Chief of Staff of the United States Army. He was on his way to commanding NATO. He was on his way to being elected president. But inside him, on the night Patton died, there was a question no one else could answer. Had his old friend been trying to warn him about something Eisenhower himself refused to see? After Patton's death, the body was transported from Heidelberg to Luxembourg under heavy military escort. The decision to bury him at Ham, alongside the men of his Third Army, was not Eisenhower's. It was the Patton family's. Beatrice Patton refused to allow her husband's remains to be returned to the United States for a stateside funeral. She insisted that George had loved his soldiers too much for his bones to be taken away from them. The gravediggers worked through Christmas Eve in a cold drizzle, chiseling open a slot in the frozen Luxembourg clay. Patton was laid to rest in a plain pine box wrapped in a single American flag, with a 4-star general's insignia pinned to his chest and his ivory-handled revolver placed by his side. The grave was marked with a temporary wooden cross. Across the central path, 5,000 other crosses stood in perfect ranks, names and serial numbers carved into each one. Above the entire cemetery, the chapel walls held the names of 3,000 more men whose bodies had never been recovered. Patton chose to be among his men, not above them. That decision, more than anything else, became the symbolic core of his legend. Because nothing else about Patton was simple, the simple image of the 4-star general buried among privates would echo through the next 80 years of American military memory, repeated in every biography, every film, every documentary, every speech at every veterans reunion from Boston to Bakersfield. Eisenhower sent a wreath. The note attached to it read the following words: "For George, who trusted me with the most difficult commands of the war, and who never once broke faith with the men he led. With my deepest admiration and my eternal sorrow, Ike." That note was never published at the time. It sat in the Patton family archive for almost 50 years before it was quietly donated to the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene. But on the day the wreath was delivered, Eisenhower was already 3,000 miles away. He was in Washington. He was being considered for the role of Chief of Staff of the Army. He was meeting with the president. He was thinking about nuclear deterrence, the Soviet border in Iran, the chaos in Greece, the rising communist influence in Eastern Europe, the demobilization crisis, the veteran unemployment, the Pacific occupation, and the unfinished business of military justice in the Pacific theater. The funeral in Luxembourg was, for Eisenhower, a piece of unfinished business he had been forced to delegate. It was, in his mind, a debt he owed. And debts mattered to Eisenhower, even when the man he owed them to could no longer collect. The next 9 months between December 1945 and September 1946 were the most politically intense period Eisenhower had ever experienced up to that moment. Inside the Pentagon, Eisenhower was being quietly groomed for succession by General George C. Marshall, who saw him as the only officer capable of uniting the post-war army behind a coherent Cold War doctrine. Eisenhower was exhausted. He was writing policy memos on nuclear targeting, signing off on the deployment of American divisions to the Soviet border in Turkey, drafting contingency plans for an invasion of the Soviet Union in the event of a clash over Eastern Europe, sitting through marathon briefings with the Joint Chiefs, and trying to reconcile his deep personal dislike of the British Empire with the strategic fact that Britain was now America's most important intelligence partner. He had his own private views about Patton's death. In a quiet moment with his aide, Colonel Walter Bedell Smith, in the spring of 1946, Eisenhower reportedly said something that has never been publicly attributed to him, but has circulated in archival transcripts for years. He said the following: "I never trusted the circumstances of that crash. The timing was suspicious. The location was suspicious. The fact that the German doctors treating George were also treating Nazi prisoners with experimental spinal trauma was something I could not ignore." He continued, "I cannot prove anything, and I will not attempt to prove anything, because the only thing I would accomplish would be to destroy the reputations of men who are trying to save Europe from a second wave of catastrophe. George died. He died a soldier's death. But I will not pretend to you that I am satisfied with the paperwork." Bedell Smith, who had been Patton's constant rival inside SHAEF and who had signed several of the most critical orders that ended Patton's career, said nothing in response. He simply nodded, closed the file, and said, "It's over." Whether or not anyone was listening, however, was about to change. Because in the summer of 1946, a British intelligence operative named Douglas Bazada, who had served for years as a liaison officer between British Special Operations Executive Assets and the OSS, began telling journalists and former OSS colleagues that he had been approached in the final months of the war by a man who described himself as a representative of a clandestine Soviet-aligned network of intelligence officers in Central Europe. According to Bezada's later testimony, the man had offered him a small glass vial containing a refined form of cyanide allegedly manufactured in a clandestine laboratory in Czechoslovakia. According to Bezada, the man had described the substance as capable of producing a symptom profile indistinguishable from pulmonary embolism after traumatic spinal cord injury. According to Bezada, he had refused the assignment. According to Bezada, several of his former colleagues had not. The allegation was explosive. It directly implicated one or more unknown actors inside the post-war occupation structure in the death of the most controversial American general of the 20th century. It directly contradicted the official cause of death on Patton's own death certificate. It directly pointed at the Czechoslovak Soviet intelligence apparatus. It directly pointed at Eisenhower himself, because Eisenhower was the man who had full operational authority over the entire occupation zone, including the Czech liaison missions in Bavaria, and it would, if proven, have detonated the entire post-war narrative about Eisenhower as a benign stabilizer of Europe. Patton's family was devastated. The Patton sons, George Patton IV and John Patton, demanded a full congressional inquiry. The inquiry was never held. Eisenhower, by then Chief of Staff, quietly ensured that the matter would be handled within Army channels and that the file would be closed. The matter was closed, however, only on paper. Inside Eisenhower's private correspondence, the matter was never closed. He asked Bedell Smith to quietly investigate whether any British liaison officer could have been involved in any operation that touched Patton's command during the last 6 months of the war. He asked former OSS station chief in Bern, Alan Dulles, whether any Nazi assassination specialists had been integrated into Soviet-aligned networks under the cover of Operation Paperclip. He asked General Lucius Clay, the military governor of the American Zone, whether any Czech or Soviet agent had penetrated the 7th Army security perimeter in Mannheim. Every inquiry came back negative. Every investigation was concluded. Every file was stamped secret and buried under 4 layers of classification in storage facilities that would not be open to the public for another 50 years. But the questions did not die. The questions lived inside Eisenhower, and on the morning of September 28, 1946, the questions drove him out of a black staff car in Luxembourg and onto a quiet gravel path that led to a single white cross. The atmosphere inside the cemetery that morning was strange. The 5,000 graves were immaculate. The hedges were trimmed. The grass was cut to a precise military standard. The chapel bells were silent. Inside the visitors' center, a single American flag hung limp in the absence of wind. Eisenhower refused the crowd that had gathered near the entrance, refused the press that had been tipped off by the State Department, refused the chaplain who wanted to walk beside him for the formal ceremony. He walked alone. Most witnesses said he walked with one hand in his coat pocket and the other hand hanging stiffly at his side, the way Patton had always held his right hand slung low when he was thinking. He stopped in front of the temporary wooden cross. He stood there for more than 7 minutes. The military aide assigned to shadow him kept his eyes on the gravel path. The driver kept the engine running for warmth. The chaplain kept his prayer book open in his hand but closed it when he saw the general's expression. The aides reported later that Eisenhower had spoken quietly while standing above the grave. They could not hear the words. They could not see his lips move clearly in the gray September light. But one of them said that he had heard something that sounded like, "Sorry, George, I should have been closer." A second aide, however, said he had heard something different. He had heard the phrase, "There is no way back, George. The order is finished." Whether either of those phrases was real, whether either was a fragment of a longer thought, whether either was an internal monologue whispered aloud or simply misinterpreted by a young soldier standing 12 yards away, would never be resolved. The fact remained that Eisenhower stood there, alone, longer than any witness thought appropriate for a chief of staff paying formal respects to a subordinate. He turned. He walked away. He did not look back. He got in the car. He told his driver to go straight to the airfield, not through the cemetery gate streets, not past the press, but through the service road that fed directly onto Highway 1 toward Luxembourg Air Base. He did not speak again until the wheels lifted off. He said only one thing on the way back to England that night. He said, "We are going to need every serious officer we have left, and we are going to need them soon." That single sentence was the first time Eisenhower had publicly linked Patton's death to the strategic pressures of the emerging Cold War. And it was the last time he ever discussed Patton's death in the presence of any aide for the rest of his life. The reason Eisenhower went to Luxembourg was not triumph. It was not grief. It was not theatrical commemoration. It was not a public relations gesture designed to display American unity in front of European allies. The reason Eisenhower went to Luxembourg was that the post-war world he was about to inherit would force him to operate for the rest of his career inside shadows he had previously refused to acknowledge. Patton had been the most visible critic of those shadows, and Patton was now gone. The man who replaced Patton in Eisenhower's thinking was not, however, a man at all. It was a doctrine. It was a doctrine about secrecy. It was a doctrine about the management of aggression. It was a doctrine about the necessity of building an American-led Western security architecture capable of absorbing the shock of an inevitable confrontation with the Soviet Union. Eisenhower knew that he could not do that openly. He knew that the American public wanted demobilization, wanted normality, wanted their sons home, wanted their ration books canceled, wanted their economy restored. He knew that the rising Congress, dominated by isolationist Republicans, would not tolerate the architecture he was forced to build. He knew that even Truman, the man he served, was skeptical of the kind of military expenditures that a sustained Cold War would require. He knew that only one man had ever possessed the kind of raw public leverage that could have dragged the American people into a new security state without political destruction. That man was George Patton, and Patton was dead. Eisenhower stood above the grave in Luxembourg because he was trying to decide whether the unfinished business Patton had left behind was something he would carry alone, or whether he would bury it the way Patton had been buried himself. The deeper mystery behind that visit, however, sits in a much stranger corner of the historical record. 3 days before Eisenhower's arrival in Luxembourg, a coded message had been intercepted by Army cryptographers at Fort Meade and forwarded to the Pentagon. The message had originated in an undisclosed location inside the Soviet occupation zone of Austria. It had been addressed to a previously unknown communications cell inside the French occupation zone of Germany. Its contents, when partially decoded years later by NSA historians, contained a single operational phrase, an operational phrase that has never been released in full, but that one decrypted fragment refers to the senior American general whose death was being exploited by the Western press for political destabilization purposes. The cryptographers concluded that the message was a vague Soviet intelligence fragment about Patton's posthumous reputation. But what made the message truly strange was the fact that a copy of the same message, or at least a message containing the same operational language, had been delivered to Allen Dulles at the OSS station in Bern 8 months earlier, in January 1946, days before Patton was officially pronounced dead. The wording was close enough that two analysts working decades apart concluded independently that the Soviets had not been reacting to Patton's death. They had been anticipating it. Whether that anticipation was arrogance, whether it was confirmation of an earlier operational decision, whether it was intelligence chatter about a sabotage attempt that had been planned and was not actually carried out, whether it was a coincidence that has been magnified across the decades by researchers inclined toward conspiracy, no one has ever conclusively determined. But the existence of those two deciphered fragments, sitting in two different intelligence archives, is part of the reason Eisenhower stepped out of the car that morning with the tension visible in his face. He was not simply visiting a grave, he was closing a loop. He was making sure that no one would ever use Patton's name as a tool against the post-war order he was about to build. Behind every decision Eisenhower made that month, the ghost of Patton sat in the corner. Eisenhower had not approved the official version of Patton's death. He had simply failed to challenge it. He had failed to challenge it because the cost of challenging it would have been catastrophic. It would have exposed the supposedly successful Anglo-American occupation of Germany as a contested battleground for future Cold War maneuvering. It would have revealed that the Americans and the British were already cooperating with former Wehrmacht officers on technical issues that the Soviets considered acts of war. It would have required Eisenhower to publicly accuse the British of conducting sabotage operations inside the American zone. It would have required Eisenhower to open the sealed X-ray files from the Heidelberg Hospital. It would have required Eisenhower to admit that the medical staff treating Patton had included former Nazi medical officers who had themselves conducted experimental spinal cord research on concentration camp prisoners just 8 months earlier. None of those disclosures were survivable. Eisenhower knew it. Patton would not have known it, and that was the difference between the two generals. Patton had never been able to think strategically about his own reputation. He had always been willing to detonate himself publicly for the sake of his own vision of how the post-war world should be arranged. Eisenhower, by contrast, was capable of swallowing the cost of silence, because Eisenhower understood that long-term strategy often required temporary moral compromise. Eisenhower's visit to the Luxembourg Cemetery in September 1946 was, in that sense, a private apology to the only man who had ever genuinely tested his willingness to compromise. The apology was silent, because silence was the only currency Eisenhower still possessed. It would be easy to overstate this moment. It would be easy to claim that Eisenhower's visit was driven by guilt, by fear, by moral cowardice, or by some hidden suspicion that he himself had been complicit in Patton's death. But none of those interpretations is supported by the documents that exist. The evidence in the Patton case, like the evidence in almost every Cold War intelligence question, is fragmented, volatile, and politically dangerous. It cannot be assembled into a clean narrative. The truth, if there is truth, is buried in the same kind of classified storage facilities that contain the missing deathbed X-rays, the unsigned autopsy protocols, the sealed medical board reports, the destroyed post-mortem tissue samples, and the never-released counterintelligence debriefs of the GMC truck driver, the Cadillac driver, and the staff captain who had been sitting in the front seat of Patton's car the morning of the crash. None of that is clean, none of that is narrative, none of that resolves. But the visit itself resolves one thing. It confirms that Eisenhower understood that Patton's death mattered in ways that went far beyond the simple fact that Patton had been a brilliant battlefield commander. Patton had been the most dangerous voice inside the American military establishment in the post-war months. He had been the only officer willing to publicly accuse the British and the Americans of coddling the Nazis. He had been the only officer willing to publicly accuse the Soviet Union of being the next great threat to Western civilization. He had been the only officer willing to publicly accuse the occupation governments of cowardice and short-sightedness. He had been the only officer willing to publicly mock the very concept of denazification as it was being practiced in the American zone. He had been the most articulate American critic of the emerging post-war order, and he had been completely uncontrolled. Eisenhower, who was about to inherit the apparatus that ordered was supposed to protect, could not afford to let that voice survive beyond his death, and it did not survive. What follows from the cemetery visit is the long, slow public rewriting of Patton's memory. Within 6 months of Eisenhower's return from Luxembourg, Patton's official War Department biography was rewritten. Within 12 months, the denazification controversies were quietly retired. Within 24 months, Patton's posthumous reputation had been raised from controversial pariah to legendary American hero. The transformation was deliberate. It had to be. Eisenhower understood that a post-war American army could not be built on the visible humiliation of its own greatest field commander. He understood that future generals, including those he himself would soon promote to divisional command in the European theater, needed to believe in the moral authority of their own institution. The institution could not survive if Patton's last speeches were widely published. The institution could survive if Patton's last speeches were studiously ignored. The institution could not survive if the public continued to believe that Patton had been murdered by shadowy agents of foreign powers. The institution could survive if Patton's death was accepted as the tragic accident that it appeared on paper. So the rewrite began. Within 18 months, Hollywood was producing films in which Patton was portrayed as a heroic, principled warrior whose only flaw was his temper. Within 36 months, biographies were being commissioned that emphasized Patton's compassion for his troops and his brilliant tactical mind. Within 60 months, school textbooks in the United States were teaching a new generation of American children that Patton had been a man whose great tragedy was that he died before he could finish the great work of defeating communism in Eastern Europe. The narrative worked. It worked because it had a partial truth inside it that the public could accept without feeling deceived. Patton had, after all, been brilliant. Patton had, after all, loved his troops. Patton had, after all, opposed the Soviets. The rewrite did not require invention. It required only silence about the things the public was not supposed to know. It required silence about the German doctors. It required silence about the missing X-rays. It required silence about the sealed autopsy. It required silence about the Soviet intercepts. It required silence about the German medical experimentation. It required silence about the question Alan Dulles was quietly investigating in Switzerland in the spring of 1946. It required silence about the question Walter Bedell Smith was asking inside the Pentagon in the summer of 1946. It required silence about the only thing Eisenhower could not bring himself to say out loud when he walked away from the grave on September 28, 1946. It required silence about the possibility that the post-war order might be founded, in part, on the deliberate killing of one of its own creators. Whether Eisenhower knew the full truth of Patton's death will never be confirmed. The documents have not been released. The witnesses have died. The interpreters of the intercepts have retired. The medical staff have disappeared into the anonymity of post-war American suburbia. The driver of the Cadillac died in 1977 and took his version of events to the grave. The driver of the truck was never publicly identified. The captain in the front seat of the Cadillac refused every interview request from every historian who ever tracked him down. The sealed tissue samples released by the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in the year 2000 revealed nothing conclusive. The X-rays released in 2004 were partial frames. The autopsy protocol released in 2007 was handwritten in German by a physician whose name does not appear on any roster of surviving 7th Army medical staff. The handwriting was never matched. The signature was never authenticated. The conclusion was, as always, inconclusive. And so the mystery persists. It persists not because the truth is being hidden by some grand conspiracy, but because the truth was always complicated, always strategic, always intertwined with the larger logic of the Cold War that Eisenhower was about to inherit. Patton was not simply a man who died. Patton was a man whose death served multiple political functions for multiple governments, and no government was prepared to admit that to the public because no government could afford to admit it. The simplest explanation, that Patton died of natural causes triggered by his spinal injury, may be exactly right. The simplest explanation, however, is not the only explanation. The simplest explanation is not necessarily the correct one, and Eisenhower, who understood better than anyone alive that the simplest explanation is rarely the strategic one, could not walk away from Patton's grave without leaving a small piece of his own conscience buried in the Luxembourg soil beside his oldest friend. The power of that September visit, however, is not exhausted by political calculation. The power of that September visit is that Eisenhower went alone. He went without press. He went without chaplain. He went without family. He went without the full retinue of aides and generals who normally accompanied him on every formal duty. He went as a friend. He went to stand in front of a cross and to reckon with the silence that had been forced upon him by his position, his duty, and his country's post-war posture. He went to accept, quietly and without witnesses, the cost of being the man who had to inherit Patton's unfinished war. He went to absorb, for 7 silent minutes, the burden of being the officer who had not been able to protect Patton from the political consequences of his own honesty. He went to confront, for the last and only time in his life, the question of whether Patton had been murdered. He went with the full knowledge that the answer to that question would never be public, would never be official, would never be acceptable in any post-war narrative that could survive the scrutiny of Congress or the press or the rising Soviet intelligence apparatus that was already listening to every American signal in Europe. He went because Patton's death was the moment when Eisenhower finally understood the true price of becoming the man who would inherit the Western world. The price was that he would never be able to say what he thought. The price was that he would never be able to defend the man he most respected. The price was that he would never be able to admit the limits of his own authority. The price was that he would never be able to tell the American people that the war in Europe had not truly ended in 1945, that the next war was already arriving, that the men who had died for Europe in 1945 had only purchased time, and that the time they had purchased was already running out. Standing above the grave in Luxembourg, Eisenhower became the man who would carry all of those secrets for the next 40 years. He became the man who would build NATO out of the wreckage of Schaeff. He became the man who would authorize the development of the hydrogen bomb. He became the man who would threaten nuclear retaliation against the Soviet Union in defense of Western Europe. He became the man who would sit in the Oval Office and refuse to allow Patton's name to be invoked by anyone who wanted to provoke a premature war with the Soviets. He became the man who would maintain the structure of post-war American power for 8 years in the White House, then hand it off to his successors, then retire to Gettysburg, then watch his old friend Truman fall from political grace, then watch McCarthy rise and fall, then watch the Cuban Missile Crisis nearly detonate the world, then watch Vietnam collapse every assumption he had ever made about military doctrine, all the while carrying the memory of Patton's grave in the back of his mind. He became the man who, in the last interview he ever gave about Patton, would say only the following: "George Patton was the brawest man I ever knew. He was also the most difficult, and he was probably the most prophetic." The phrase, "the most prophetic," has lingered in military history circles for over half a century. It is the single most revealing sentence Eisenhower ever said about his old friend. It reveals that Eisenhower understood, even on the day Patton died, that Patton's warnings about the Soviet Union were more accurate than anyone in Washington wanted to admit. It reveals that Eisenhower understood that the next war was inevitable. It reveals that Eisenhower understood, finally, that the general who had broken his lance against the political leadership of his own country was the one who had been right about the most important strategic question of the post-war era. The most prophetic sentence was not, however, a confession. It was a quiet recognition. It was a recognition that, in 1946, Eisenhower had stood above a grave, had carried a secret he would never be able to speak, had inherited a war he would have to fight with different tools than Patton had possessed, and had walked back into the world of power as the silent inheritor of an unfinished American destiny. It was a recognition that Eisenhower understood what most historians would not admit for another 60 years. The Cold War did not begin in 1947 with the Truman Doctrine. The Cold War did not begin in 1948 with the Berlin blockade. The Cold War began in 1945, on the night an armored Cadillac hit a truck in Mannheim and an old cavalry officer died in a hospital bed in Heidelberg. The Cold War began in the silence that followed Patton's death, and the only man in the world who was permitted to walk away from that silence was Eisenhower, and the only price he had to pay for walking away was the weight of a single 20-minute detour through a quiet Luxembourg cemetery on a cold September morning in 1946. The rest of his life was built on that silence. The entire post-war order was built on that silence, and the question that has haunted American military historians for 80 years is whether Eisenhower's willingness to bear that silence was a moral compromise, or whether it was the only available act of statesmanship capable of protecting the Western world from the catastrophe Patton had foreseen. The question will never have a public answer. It will never have a public answer, because Eisenhower walked away from Patton's grave without ever turning around. He walked away because there was nothing more to say. He walked away because the men Patton had warned about were already rising over the eastern horizon. He walked away because the war Patton had predicted had already begun, and he walked away because the only way to win a war that no one else was prepared to admit was happening was to pretend, in public, that it had not yet started, even though the man who had warned the world about it was already buried in the soil beneath his feet. That was the secret of Eisenhower's visit. That was the secret he carried for the rest of his life. That was the secret that explained why the greatest general of the 20th century visited the most controversial general of the 20th century 10 months after his mysterious death. He did not visit him to honor him. He did not visit him to mourn him. He visited him to ask forgiveness. He visited him to give him credit for a future Eisenhower himself would not be alive to fully see. And he visited him to whisper to the silence of the dead that the war Patton had foreseen, the war Eisenhower would spend the rest of his life fighting, was already beginning to arrive. The only question Patton could not answer, because Patton was already dead, was whether the world his friend was about to inherit was the world his friend had wanted to create. The question was never resolved. But on the morning of September 28, 1946, in the small Luxembourg cemetery at Ham, a man who carried the entire post-war future of the Western world on his shoulders leaned slightly forward above a temporary wooden cross, and the cold wind off the Alzette River shifted direction for just a moment, and somewhere in the distance, an American military chaplain quietly closed his prayer book, and the world moved on.